Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're opening a window not just into history, but into the deep, often really turbulent interior life of the 17th century. We're doing a deep dive into a spiritual text that, frankly, is so radical in its instruction. It promises a kind of shortcut to this profound, undisturbed inner quiet, to divine union even.
But there's a catch.
A huge catch. And this is the vital caveat, right? It only does so through a path of almost complete, and I think for many people, terrifying and uncomfortable surrender.
Yeah, that's the price of admission. The source we're digging into today is the sweet yoke of inner quiet and divine union.
And it's an absolutely essential source for understanding the history of contemplative practice. The historical context, as you were saying before we started, is just, it's everything here.
It is. The author is a figure known as Molinos from the mid-17th century. And you have to understand, his teachings, well, they weren't just gentle advice. They were seen as completely revolutionary.
How so? What was so radical?
He pointed towards a path of spiritual communion that was so simple, so direct, that it basically circumvented all the elaborate systems, the rituals, the intellectual hoops you had to jump through in the established church structure of his time.
And that, historically speaking, is a guaranteed recipe for institutional backlash.
Oh, a massive one. It was. This idea of a deeper, quieter, personal relationship with the divine was so challenging to the established religious power structures that he was severely persecuted by the Vatican.
And not just a little bit. The sources are pretty clear on this.
No, we're talking extreme cruelty, defamation, organized persecution. But what makes this so relevant to the text itself is his reaction to it all.
Right.
He met all this turmoil with just silent endurance. The sources famously describe him as being like a lamb led to the slaughter, completely mute.
That silence, that refusal to engage externally, even just to defend himself, it perfectly encapsulates the very essence of his teaching, doesn't it?
It's the ultimate proof of concept.
Yeah. If the whole teaching is about inner quiet and surrender, his life was the final exam, and he was facing maximum external chaos.
Precisely. And that immediately sets the stage for us. I mean, if his ideas were powerful enough to draw that kind of institutional fire that ultimately led to his downfall, they must contain something profoundly challenging.
Challenging to what exactly?
To the human tendency toward control, toward intellectual control, toward external performance. Think about what the status quo prioritized back then.
Outward works, meticulous confessions, rituals.
Exactly. Elaborate rituals, dense theological study, and Molinos' simple, private path of passive love and inner quiet. Well, it threatened to make all of those intermediaries, all those gatekeepers, feel a bit unnecessary.
So our mission today is not just a historical study. Our goal here is to extract the practical guidance he left behind in this, this manual from the 1600s and see if we can translate it.
Translate it into something actionable for achieving internal peace in the 21st century.
Right. Because the text is all about radically subjecting one's will to a higher purpose, adopting what Molinos called the sweet yoke, and fundamentally refining what he termed the soul life.
And we really need to spend a moment defining that term soul life. It's a key concept.
Okay.
For Molinos, the soul life is the part of us that's driven by our senses, our own efforts, our raw emotions, and most importantly, our active intellect. It's the part that's always striving, always analyzing, always doing.
The busy part.
The very busy part. And the text's goal is to refine or, purge this soul life so that the spirit, which he calls the deepest center of the person, God's dwelling place, can finally emerge and rule.
So the key takeaway for you, the learner, before we even start is this. This isn't some dusty theology, even though it uses that kind of language. This is a manual for dealing with constant, modern, internal chaos, for dealing with burnout by understanding and adopting this sweet yoke of surrender.
It's about shifting the focus from the chaotic, striving soul life to the quiet, resting spirit.
So where do we start? The manual draws this sharp, almost jarring line between two fundamentally different ways of engaging in spiritual communion.
We begin with the transition, the necessary but ultimately temporary transition from doing to simply being.
Okay, let's start with what most people, both back then and today, would probably understand as prayer. Molinos defined two distinct levels. The first one he calls simple prayer. This is where pretty much everyone starts.
Right. And simple prayer, or what we can call type 1 prayer, is defined very simply as talking to God. Or, as the source text puts it, traffic in the mind with God.
Traffic in the mind. That's a great phrase. It's a relationship built on communication, on concepts.
And it's necessary. Molinos argues this is the starting point because in the beginning, we can't yet see him, not in the way he means. We don't have that internal faculty developed yet.
So if you can't see, you have to talk. It makes sense. You use the tools you have, and for most of us, that's the mind, our intellect.
Exactly. So this is an entirely intellectual and active endeavor. It involves using your intellect, your reasoning, your imagination to conceive of God, to meditate on his nature, to apply specific theological ideas. It's an active concentration.
And it requires diligent effort. It's not passive.
Not at all. It's a lot of work, though he's clear that that effort is always aided by divine grace. Still, you are the one doing the concentrating.
Can you give us an example of what this active intellectual prayer would actually look like then and now?
Sure. In Molinos' time, it might have been an intense hour-long meditation on the Passion of Christ, carefully analyzing each stage of the suffering, or systematically reasoning through the virtues you wanted to cultivate.
Very structured.
Today, it might look like journaling or really focused Bible study where you're breaking down the text, or even carefully crafting these lengthy prayers of petition and intercession. The mind is fully engaged in structuring the conversation.
And the analogy the text uses for this is crucial. It compares this type 1 prayer to seeking or preparing the feast.
That's it. You are diligently concentrating all your inner strength, preparing yourself, making sure everything is perfect for the encounter. It's all about disciplined effort and conscious focus.
So it's the path to the city, but it's not the city itself.
Beautifully put. And Molinos emphasizes that this simple prayer is necessary. If you don't do this prep work, this active seeking, you will probably never progress. But, and here's the sharp turn, this is where nearly everyone stops.
They get stuck in the preparation.
They prepare the feast year after year. They get really good at it. They perfect the recipes. They polish the silverware. But they never realize that the destination isn't the preparation. It's the arrival. It's eating the feast.
So the striving itself becomes the spiritual life.
Yeah.
Instead of just the means to it. That sounds a lot like modern productivity culture invading the spiritual realm.
It's the spiritualization of performance. And Molinos is arguing that performance, that intellectual striving, has some really severe limitations when you're trying to reach the deepest level of union.
Which brings us to the next stage. This is where the text introduces the really radical shift. Molinos defines this higher prayer, or type 2, not as talking, but as gazing at him.
And it's described as a higher, simpler practice. And that word simpler is the first massive hurdle for the intellectual person.
Because simple feels like we're not doing enough.
Exactly. The transition happens when the mind has finally done its job and is, for lack of a better word, satisfied. When your intellect, through all that diligent type 1 work, has reasoned itself into conviction. When it doesn't need any more evidence or conceptual scaffolding to be convinced of God's reality.
When you've thought it through enough.
Right. At that point, you're ready. And you naturally move into a deeper, quieter relationship. The first kind of prayer is thinking about God. The second is simply resting in and gazing at him.
I find that shift, honestly, a little terrifying. If I stop thinking, if I stop analyzing, how do I know I'm not just slipping into spiritual laziness or just daydreaming?
And that is precisely the paradox he addresses. This higher practice demands that you stop the active intellect. When you enter this second stage, you stop using your reasoning faculties as the main channel.
You're moving out of that noisy soul life.
Into the stillness of the spirit. You enter into rest.
What practically does that resting involve? Is it just, emptying the mind, like in some forms of meditation?
It's subtly different. It's not just about clearing the mind to create a void. The focus shifts to simply seeing, gazing at, and loving God. It's a loving, focused attention.
Not a blank slate.
No. And crucially, the text instructs the believer to gently exclude all the mental images, all the concepts, all the intrusive thoughts that try to crowd into your mind.
Gently. That's the key word there. It's not a violent wrestling match with every thought that crosses your path, which is just exhausting.
Right. It's just softly turning away from them, allowing the mind to rest and fix itself on that simple presence. The shift is radical.
Yeah.
From active conversation to passive reception.
The text sums it up as emerging out of love, gazing, quietness, the rejection of all things, and the subjection of your will to God.
It's focusing all your internal strength on that single deepest center of your being.
Which brings us to the first major psychological hurdle for the modern learner, I think.
Yeah.
This paradox of abandoning the very path that brought you success in the first place.
This is a critical insight, especially for anyone who relies heavily on structure or habits or specific techniques. Molinos says that we grasp God through different ways or methods. These are the paths to arrive at his presence. But once those paths are established, once you've actually arrived at the destination, he says, you must put the path itself aside.
Stop relying on the methods that got you there.
Exactly. Don't cling to the techniques or the elaborate intellectual frameworks that brought you to this point of rest.
But that's so hard. It's like you don't need the map anymore once you're standing in the city. But the person who found success with the map, who used it to define their whole spiritual identity, they're going to feel completely lost without it.
They are. And that feeling of being lost is actually a necessary part of the process. This higher state is far beyond the realm of conceptual knowledge. It's described as a solitary conversation, this utterly simple dwelling, as if only the two of you exist in the universe.
And that kind of intimacy requires a silence that all our intellectual striving just naturally breaks.
It does. So type 1 was seeking and preparing the feast, which required immense diligence. Type 2 is finding and enjoying the feast. It shifts from the hard work of preparation to the effortless consumption of what's been prepared.
Which highlights the final point of this section. This second road is not effective through human will or effort.
No. You cannot force yourself into this quietness through sheer mental muscle. It's a gift. It's received when the soul is quiet enough to hold it. It's a state you attain through grace and simplicity, but it's not something you can control. The moment you start trying to perform the quietness,
you're right back in type 1.
You're right back to preparing the feast.
So if Molinos is telling us that effort, technique, and intellect have to be set aside eventually, what's left? What's the engine of this whole thing?
The answer is something extremely radical, both for the 17th century and for our performance-driven world today. It's pure love and total surrender.
Okay, let's break that down. Love over knowledge and work.
He starts by establishing a profound limitation on our intellect. The text basically says that our knowledge of the divine has a ceiling. Even the wisest, most diligent person's true knowledge of God in this life remains, and I'm quoting, very limited.
Wow. That is a staggering statement of intellectual humility. So all your studying, all your theological frameworks, all your hard-won religious knowledge, it's limited. It can only take you so far.
You can imagine how that went over with the highly educated clergy of his time.
Well, I'm sure it infuriated them.
It did, because it devalued their primary currency, which was knowledge. But Molinos pivots immediately to the alternative that has no such limitation: love. He argues that while our knowledge is limited, the believer can, however, love him much more.
There's no ceiling on love.
There's no ceiling on love. And this isn't just a warm, fuzzy feeling. This love is described as something that God grants, which the believer then simply pours out. And this act of pouring it out is declared to be more valuable than anything you could do for him.
More valuable than any action, any service.
Think about that. More valuable than any mission trip, any book you could write, any public service, any rigorous theological debate. The simple, quiet, surrendered love poured out internally is the most valuable spiritual currency.
That completely reorients the spiritual life from outward demonstration to inward disposition.
Completely. So if a learner today believes their primary spiritual duty is to do something, to serve, to volunteer, to speak, Molinos is arguing that those actions, if they're divorced from this internal simplicity, are worth less than the simple state of gazing in love.
And the reward for this radical abandonment.
It confirms the priority. When you release everything, all your methods, all your striving, your need for external spiritual success, and just throw yourself into this embrace of love, the reward isn't just personal peace. The text says the reward is an immediate increase in your capacity and strength.
To do what?
Specifically, the capacity to love him even more intensely. The Lord replaces your effort with an ability to sustain a deeper relationship.
That's fascinating. It's like a spiritual economy of subtraction leading to multiplication.
Yeah.
You surrender your effort, your control, your desire to know, and the return on that investment is a deeper internal wellspring.
And that leads directly to the next concept, which is the foundation for everything else: embracing the sweet yoke.
Right. So as the believer starts going down this deeper path, they might feel a pull to stop the other stuff, the external intellectual prayer.
And Molinos addresses this psychological shift head on because it can be easily confused with laziness or, just being tired. He asserts that this desire to abandon external prayer is not from natural fatigue or a dry spell. He says it is divinely initiated.
So God himself is sparking this desire in the soul to enter into rest.
That's the idea. So if you, the listener, feel a profound yearning to stop all the busy spiritual work and just be in quietness, the text suggests that's a confirmation. It's an invitation onto the deeper path.
An internal prompt of grace.
Yes, but to truly access the peace of that path, it requires absolute, complete compliance, not just in prayer, but in life. You have to subject your will entirely to God's will. This is the sweet yoke.
Why sweet? The yoke sounds restrictive, burdensome.
It's sweet because it removes the intolerable burden of maintaining your own self-will and trying to control an uncontrollable universe.
Okay, let's translate that into modern terms, because this is where the teaching becomes instantly practical and extremely challenging. What does subjecting your will look like on a Tuesday afternoon?
It means accepting the conditions of your reality without that constant internal struggle. For example, say you're stuck in a job you dislike. Resistance says, I have to fight this, I have to complain about this, I have to resent every single minute until I can escape.
Which is how most of us live.
Right. But submitting to the sweet yoke says something different. It says, this circumstance is currently his will for me. I accept the difficulty, and I will find peace not in escaping the job, but in aligning my internal disposition with this moment, however unpleasant it is.
So the yoke isn't the difficulty itself. The yoke is the acceptance of the difficulty as a vessel for his will.
Exactly. The real pain comes from our own resistance to the reality that is not necessarily from the reality itself.
And the warning about the alternative path here is pretty stark.
It is. Molinos states that a believer who insists on demanding that everything go their way, who clings to their own will never know the path of peace. Their life will be, quote, empty and painful, full of anxiety and confusion.
Because they're at war with reality.
They're at war with reality. They'll never find the road of peace because peace requires conformity to reality, not demanding reality conform to your wishes. The promise is that if you surrender to God's will and all his commands, even the difficult ones, the result is great rest, peace, and solemn quietness.
It sounds like the ultimate antidote to the constant, anxious, hyper-controlling mindset of modern life.
It's the cessation of war against the universe. It's accepting your constraints as divine scaffolding. And this concept is revolutionary because it tells the individual that the solution to their suffering isn't in changing the outside world, but in changing their internal response to it.
This theme of internal versus external then leads him to a very sharp critique of superficial religious practice, and I think it's chapter 5.
He is incredibly blunt here. He details the limitation of outward prayer and external seeking. He talks about objective and superficial discussion in prayer repeated year after year that leads to spiritual stagnation and, quote, wasted much time.
So, motion without progress.
Yes. The critique is that this kind of external effort yields minimal benefit. At best, only a little external spiritual gain. And the core realization he hits the learner with is almost accusatory. If you have the Lord within you, why on earth are you exhausting yourself looking for him outside? Why puzzle your brains looking for other places to pray, selecting subjects for prayer, and striving to seek him outside?
He's challenging the fundamental assumption that we need external input, a specific church, a specific ritual, a specific book to connect. He's forcing the realization that the greatest treasure is already internal.
He is. And the quoted lament he uses here perfectly captures this spiritual misdirection. He says, I have searched for you outside. I wandered the streets and squares of the world, but I could not find you because I was looking outside for what is within me. How vain.
That's powerful. It's the ultimate diagnosis of spiritual blindness.
It is. Yeah. And the reality, according to the text, is that we are his living temple, his only true dwelling place. So to seek God outside while he dwells within is, well, it's blindness. He uses an analogy. How can a hungry person be satisfied if they refuse to taste the food that's right in front of them? He says, many good people pursue God diligently their whole lives, but never enjoy him, because they refuse to recognize the simplicity and immediacy of his inner dwelling.
So the transition to the higher prayer, accepting the sweet yoke, realizing the inner dwelling, these are all interconnected steps in shifting sovereignty from the striving self to the resting spirit.
That's the whole progression.
Okay, we've established that the essential spiritual work is internal. It's focused on love and surrender. But now we need to know how these teachings actually function when life happens, when the inevitable external chaos and internal suffering arrive. Where do we find stability when the world intrudes?
This is where he introduces the idea of the spirit as the kingdom. Molinos defines your spiritual core. what he calls your spirit or your center, with profound significance. He calls it the center of the whole person. But more importantly, he defines it as God's dwelling place. It is his kingdom.
That's a radical elevation of the inner life. It's not just a quiet corner of your mind, it's the throne room of the king.
Precisely. Your Lord rests there and reigns on that throne. And if he reigns there, your primary task shifts entirely. It's not about managing external affairs or mastering intellectual debates. The primary task of the believer is simply keeping the heart in peace.
Keep your heart in peace.
That's the mandate, so that this inner temple remains pure and the king's rule is undisturbed. And this simple mandate, maintain inner peace, becomes the foundational active resistance against all outside forces. It's really the only fight Molinos seems to endorse.
But the world is not quiet. Maintaining peace in the face of constant intrusion seems, well, impossible sometimes. What kind of disturbances is he preparing us for?
He defines them very comprehensively. They can come in many forms. Temptations, genuine suffering, heavy persecution like he experienced, or these strange and cunning lies, deceptive thoughts that prey on your soul.
So, big things and small things.
Everything. And what's striking is the breadth of his warning. He says even everything God created can be used to cause annoyance or turmoil in your soul if you let your external circumstances dictate your internal state.
So whether it's a global political crisis, the sting of a personal betrayal, or just being chronically annoyed by a frustrating tech problem, it all poses a threat to the inner kingdom.
If you let the chaos seep in. And the necessity of retreat is the only guaranteed way to overcome these circumstances. To stop them from disturbing the center, you have to withdraw into the deepest domain, into the center of your being.
This sounds incredibly difficult, especially for the modern person who feels compelled to solve every problem instantly. How do we execute this internal retreat?
It's a deliberate psychological and spiritual withdrawal. You retreat to the place where God resides on the throne of your heart. It means consciously refusing to engage the distracting thought, the painful memory, or the external demand, and instead resting your awareness in that inner place.
The goal is just to ensure your inner peace remains intact, regardless of what's happening outside the walls.
That's it. And this brings us to the most powerful image of stability in the whole text, the unseen fortress.
The unseen fortress. This is the concept of stability in a storm. What is the spiritual architecture of this citadel?
He describes it as a divine fortress within us. It is the inner structure that guards, protects, and fights for the believer. It is the city of peace and the throne of rest. It's this silent, strong, inner dwelling place where you can be utterly safe.
And it's not a defense mechanism you construct yourself.
No, it's a reality you occupy. And the instruction when you're disturbed is so counterintuitive. We're trained to fight the disturbance, to argue with the temptation, to analyze the source of our suffering. Molinos says you don't need to fight, analyze, or be troubled. You simply need to retreat inside the fortress.
That's the only action.
That retreat is the singular, non-negotiable action. In your deep internal life, you possess this strong fortress, a bulwark that overcomes all enemies, both visible and invisible. The armor you need is already there, inside the citadel, but you have to be inside it to wear it. You can't fight from the battlements, you have to rest in the keep.
So if a terrible thought or a crushing temptation hits, the active response is the passive one. Retreat, refuse to engage, and rest.
Precisely. The ultimate instruction for enduring the storm is not to leave the safe harbor, even when the external environment is at its loudest. You have to maintain inner quiet, peace, and solemn stillness, especially when the storm rages fiercely.
And if you find your courage is lost,
you simply retreat again. You cast yourself into the arms of the Lord in simple love. The peace you strive to keep is the empirical sign that the fortress is holding.
this is an incredibly challenging demand. It requires profound trust that stopping the fight is actually the strongest possible defense. It's a very difficult psychological shift.
And that difficulty, that challenge, leads directly into the next and arguably most critical phase of this path. Recognizing that difficulty and apparent failure are not signs of error, they are signs of progress.
Okay, this is a huge one. We have to address the most challenging psychological part of this spiritual path, which Molinos anticipates and tackles head-on, the inevitable setbacks and those crushing feelings of failure.
Mm-hmm. And this is so important because this path, contrary to popular belief, is not characterized by constant spiritual highs or feelings of ecstatic union. That's a myth.
Right. So he's almost giving the learner permission to feel inadequate. He warns that failure will come, specifically failure in this inner prayer. You might feel abandoned, confused, or that your time spent in quietness is completely wasted.
Yeah, the source is very specific. It says, you will feel the Lord is no longer helping you in prayer, that you've wasted much time, and confusion and uncertainty will naturally arise. You might even look back at your old type 1 prayer life, the active, intellectual, easy-to-measure one, and feel nostalgic for it.
Thinking you were better off then.
Exactly, because the emotional feedback loop of this internal effort can seem entirely negative at times.
And the crucial warning he gives here is targeted at external influence, which makes sense, given the institutional pressure of his time.
The mandate is absolute. Do not stop. And do not let anyone, especially, he says, older believers or those who are stuck in the more rudimentary type 1 methods, convince you to abandon seeking this deeper relationship.
Because the temptation to go back to the easier, more structured intellectual prayer will be immense.
Huge. But the instruction is to persist through the barrenness.
Yeah, okay, but if the whole methodology is based on abandoning intellectual effort, how does one distinguish between persistent faith and simple spiritual stagnation, or just laziness? How do I know I'm not just avoiding the hard work?
And that is the essential difference. Laziness is characterized by comfort. It's a refusal to exert effort in any direction. The dryness Molinos describes is often characterized by internal pain, struggle, and a profound discomfort.
The discomfort of having nothing to rely on.
Yes. You want to feel something, you want the conversation to resume, but it refuses to. This path requires faith precisely because the feelings are gone.
So, when failure and confusion hit, what is the simple response? If analysis and intellectual effort are off the table, what physical or mental posture does the learner adopt?
The response is to bypass the intellect and the perceived failure entirely. You simply gaze at the Lord in fervent love and cast yourself into his tender embrace. Your spirit has to revert to the state of a child or a poor person in God's presence.
Relying on simplicity and utter dependence.
And that simplicity, the text asserts, is the most reliable relationship because it is not contingent upon your intellectual or emotional performance. It's a way to protect against the biggest enemy of this path, which is overthinking.
Right. This inner prayer is trying to escape scattered imagination and prayer based on careful thought, which both lead to distraction and self-examination when you feel like you're failing.
Which brings us to the second, deeper paradox. The absolute necessity of darkness and dryness. Molinos explains that God first draws the believer through the pleasantness of love and grace. He gives them glimpses of glory, the spiritual honeymoon period. But then, he deliberately leads them into darkness and dryness.
That is utterly counterintuitive to almost every spiritual tradition that prioritizes comfort and positive emotional feedback. Why would the source of comfort deliberately lead you into discomfort?
Because the purpose of the dryness is the same as the purpose of the love, to bring the believer closer to Christ. This is the core insight for the learner to remember during periods of desolation.
The darkness is not punishment. It's not abandonment.
It is a refinement method. It's designed to excise the last remnants of self-reliance. It forces the believer to confront the utter inadequacy of self-effort. He knows that through your own mind and your own effort, you cannot truly approach him and sustain this deep union.
So all our human efforts ultimately fail to get us onto this highest road.
They absolutely fail because that road is paved by grace and dependence, not by human will. Dryness is the divine way of proving to us through painful experience that our old methods of striving and analysis were insufficient for this deep path. It destroys the spiritual ego.
It's a mandatory training period that teaches dependence.
Yes. When you feel nothing, when your prayers are barren, when you feel distant, you are forced to rely on pure, cold faith alone. Therefore, the believer must walk by faith, or act from faith, ignoring all the dryness and perceived failures. You just walk forward believing he will not lead you astray.
The source mentions the example of someone navigating stormy seas.
In those dark moments, they find they don't need to struggle or row. They simply walk by faith, trusting the current, even if they don't understand God's heart at the time or can't see the shore.
That waiting and sitting silently before him in the midst of barrenness.
Molinos asks, what a good time that is, even if you feel nothing. This state of quiet waiting and surrender is more precious than all the emotional highs and intellectual treasures on earth because it proves the depth of the inner adherence to the divine will. It's the definitive proof that the sweet yoke has been fully adopted.
To make this feeling of failure more relatable, the text provides a really specific and memorable image: the ox treading grain. This is a wonderfully accessible analogy for anyone who feels like they're just spinning their wheels in life.
This is the perfect analogy for the modern learner who's suffering from burnout or stagnation. Imagine an ox circling a threshing floor. It walks one circle after another. It appears to be walking entirely in place, making no external forward progress.
It looks like stagnation. Tedious, repetitive, unproductive.
Right. If you just watched the ox's feet, you'd think it was stuck, failing to move. Yet with every single circuit, the ox is achieving much work. The grain is being threshed, separated, prepared. The work is utterly unseen, hidden beneath its hooves.
So was it a failure?
No. The farmer, the owner, enjoys the vast harvest that resulted from that patient, repetitive, unseen effort.
Applying this to the learner.
Yeah.
We may feel a total lack of progress in our spiritual journey, or even in a massive life effort, like a career change or raising a difficult child. We feel like we're just circling.
Doing the same repetitive motions, experiencing the same dryness. We're measuring our spiritual progress by the visible movement of our feet, not by the unseen results on the threshing floor.
But Molinos assures us that as time passes, the internal abundance that is accumulated, the refinement of the soul life, the quietness of the spirit, the habit of resting in the citadel, will far exceed what we sought.
The circling results in a steady inner peace and genuine spiritual growth that was not apparent during the effort itself.
So the instruction is clear. Persist, believe in his endless grace, and crucially, do not overanalyze or theorize about your feelings or lack of perceived progress. Stop measuring the movement of your feet and trust the unseen process.
Put your life in his loving, fatherly hand. The only way to complete the threshing is to keep circling.
So we've covered the shift to quiet gazing, the necessity of the sweet yoke, and the unexpected value of failure. Let's try to summarize the nature of this path for the learner, tying together the pain and the underlying certainty.
Okay.
This path, which requires letting go of external analytical prayer, it's defined as a painful road. It's often dark and uncertain. You might feel like you've lost divine communication, that you're just awkward and clumsy at prayer now.
It's the necessary abandonment of the ego's desperate need for certainty. It's a road where you feel like you don't know where you were going, because all the old intellectual guideposts, the maps, the rituals, the formulas, they're gone. You're moving beyond the realm of concepts.
But, and this is the key, despite all the pain and uncertainty, Molinos insists it is a road full of assurance. That sounds like a contradiction. Where does the certainty come from, if not from knowledge?
The certainty comes not from intellectual knowledge or emotional feeling, but from the simple, passive trust that your effort has been removed so that God can work. The assurance is in the commitment to submission itself.
You're certain that the shepherd leads the lamb, even if the lamb can't see the destination.
Exactly. You just have to continue, even if you feel you've lost the ability to articulate or sense that divine communication.
And to reinforce this need for simplicity over intellect, the text returns to a familiar scriptural quote from Matthew. God hides these things from the wise and understanding and reveals them to babes.
Right. And the problem with the wise is that they rely on their own wisdom. The problem with the understanding is that they demand to understand before they'll obey. The babe simply receives. This is why the effort of the mind is useless here.
You can't reach the spiritual peak with the same tools that mastered earthly knowledge.
You can't. And he ends with a gentle, memorable image that ties the simplicity of nature to the simplicity of faith. The bird analogy.
It's a beautifully grounding image.
It is. Just as the birds are looked after and supplied with daily food, they don't need eloquent, structured prayers. They don't speak beautiful or articulate prayers, but they are never discouraged or despairing over their provision. They just exist and receive.
They simply are. And if the birds, who operate entirely on simple existence and trust, are never discouraged, why should the learner be disheartened by a lack of feeling or intellectual progress on the quiet road?
The instruction is to continue, to persist, even when the path is dark and you feel awkward in your simple internal communion. You will struggle to reach any true spiritual peak without passing through this necessary stage of pain, surrender, and uncertainty that Molinos has laid out.
It's the cost of the sweet yoke.
But the burden of resistance is far, far heavier.
So to synthesize this deep dive into Molinos' teachings, we have charted this rigorous path to divine union. A path that was radical in the 17th century and is, I think, perhaps even more radical in our performance-obsessed modern age.
It requires moving decisively from active conversational prayer to passive, quiet gazing. It's about submitting our demanding human will to the sweet yoke of compliance.
And retreating to that unseen inner citadel when external chaos strikes.
And most counterintuitively, persevering through those necessary periods of dryness and failure, recognizing them as tools of refinement, not signs of abandonment.
The core tension of the text is unmistakable. It's the tension between human effort, our relentless striving to know, find, or work for the divine outside of ourselves, versus divine submission, which is just allowing him to reign silently inside our deepest domain.
It's the difference between trying to paddle upstream versus trusting the current to carry you.
Right.
And this raises an important question for every learner engaging with this source material. If, according to Molinos, the greatest value is found in simple love and pure intention, and not in intellectual knowledge or external service, what does that demand of our current, often busy, professional and personal priorities?
Think about where you are currently channeling all your energy into the seeking, when you could be enjoying the feast. Where are you circling like the ox on the threshing floor, doing deep, valuable internal work that, from your immediate emotional or intellectual perspective, currently feels like total failure?
And finally, consider this for your week ahead. What external efforts, be they intense social media analysis, the desperate need for external validation, or compulsive planning, what might you need to consciously set aside this week to discover the promised rest and peace that awaits inside your own inner fortress?
Thank you for sharing your sources with us. We've been unpacking the surprisingly radical and enduring power of the sweet yoke of inner quiet.
For more spiritual resources, visit lokaken.ai.